There is a sea change that has been happening in traditional publishing. I feel like it's just coming to a head, that it has been building for years, and that it has a huge effect on any writer who wishes to be traditionally published. When you go online and you try to research this, what I'm calling a sea change, a big, massive change that goes sort of deep under the ocean in this massive industry of traditional publishing, you will find tale after tale of editor woes, other workers, other employees in the industry, their tales of why this is happening. Namely, the usual suspects: pay disparity, the inability to live on what editors, especially newer editors in the industry, typically make, especially if they are required to live in New York City, which, like any major metro areas, the cost of living is extremely high. What you won't find, however, as much, and I have really dug into this issue for quite a long time, it's been a couple years that off and on I've been researching this. And of course, my interest in this huge change, or maybe we call it a set of changes that's taking place in the industry, has to do with its effect on writers. That's my place in the industry. I'm a writer, so I want to know what's going on, why is it happening, and how is it going to affect me and the other writers I know, the writers I teach. How do we proceed from here, from the writer's perspective? I'm not an insider in the industry in the sense of being an editor, a copy editor, a proofreader, a PR person, but I am a writer, and that's where my experience lies. So obviously, anyone who's been following in the past month the trial, the Simon & Schuster, Penguin Random House potential merger, and the trial that has happened around that, knows that that was huge news in the publishing industry. Different people had different takes. I know a lot of indie writers took great offense at the executive who classified indie writers as farm teams for traditional publishing. You know, basically the little home gardens from which the big industrial growers would, pick a few and then get their stars. Another huge, just a huge revelation from that trial was the revelation that of the best-selling books, of the high-dollar books that are sold, where the authors gain huge advances, a large percentage of those sell, I think it was fewer than a dozen copies or something. I mean, that was just crazy to me. That, and my number could be off there, but it was a very small number of copies, especially considering the money that's put into these books, just starting with the advances, not even mentioning what we can assume are advertising campaigns. Again, that's another thing that's been happening more and more. And I have seen this since I first got into the industry in my debut book came out in 2013, but I was agented for a few years before that. So I have seen in real time some of these changes. It used to be not that long ago that as a debut author, even if you didn't get a huge advance, you could count on your publisher putting some money and effort into an advertising campaign when your book was released. Now it seems to be, from what I'm hearing from authors very recently who are out there, selling books and trying to sell books, that is no longer the case, that publishing houses more and more expect writers, debut authors period, to do more and more of their own marketing. Okay, I'm on the front lines of this a little bit as an MFA instructor. I have the most amazing students, and yes, I'm completely biased about their amazingness, but I have incredible students. They are smart, they are savvy, they are hardworking writers who are serious about their craft and serious about their success in writing, however that might be defined. Not all of my students wish to be traditionally published. However, I would venture to say that a large percentage of them do. And when they learn, not only do they need to write an excellent manuscript that will get picked up by an agent if they don't have an agent, and an editor at a house, if they want a large advance, they've got to shoot for the big houses, of which there are currently 5 or 4, depending on how this merger goes. That can be overwhelming for them. And what I try to sort of warn them, teach them right out of the gate is it's no longer about just writing a great manuscript and then sitting back and waiting for the accolades and the cash to roll in. You have to do a lot of legwork. Incidentally, I think this is one big reason why indie publishing is taking off in such a big way. It has been a thing for many, many years, but I see personally a steady and increased pitch to that rise of indie publishing, because I believe authors are realizing, you know what, even if I go traditional, which is not so easy as just saying I'm going to be traditionally published. It's obviously very difficult to be traditionally published in that the odds are really stacked against you as a writer, unless you are either a proven bestseller or your debut manuscript is so spectacular and so of the moment and so desired by agents and or editors at the big houses, you're gonna potentially have a rough go of it trying to get traditionally published. I think the gatekeeping has only increased really exponentially since my debut was published. And again, that was 2013, so we're coming up on a decade ago. The barriers to entry are just extreme. And this isn't just for debuts, by the way. This is for authors who have already had books out and books that have done pretty well. So again, if you research this issue of just the general sea change in publishing, what you're going to find largely is how it affects editors, how to a lesser extent how it affects agents, but typically it's the people working for the publishing houses. And I get that, and my heart goes out to those people. Editing is a hard job, and I think a big part of it is, hey, it's a dream job. You went to school for this. You got your English degree at a great university. This has been your dream to help usher great books into the world. And many of them find, apparently, if the stories are to be believed, which I have no reason to doubt they are, they find that they get into the industry and it's great, and boy, starry-eyed, you're working with a great publishing house, you get to work with great authors, but then you start to realize the cost of living just isn't there. And many of these editors have come forward and said, hey, I have another source of income, or I'm married to someone who basically makes the majority of our income so I could do what I do. But again, my concern is really how it affects authors, and I see it affecting authors every day. And I don't have the answer, by the way, for what should happen. I do think that this sort of big change, this sort of big upheaval, would we call it? I'm not sure it's at the upheaval phase yet, but I think it can be a very good thing on a micro level and on a macro level. I think as individuals, when we go through a huge change, it can be at times upsetting, it can be confusing, it can be hard to know which way to go, where to turn. I think the same typically holds true on a much larger scale, and the publishing industry is a much larger scale. It is huge. I obviously am driving, I don't have the dollar figures in front of me, but if you, again, do a little research, look up the types of dollars we're talking about when we're talking about the publishing industry in general, and some of the advances, these high six-figure advances that authors are getting. It's a big deal, financially speaking. It's a big game that's happening in publishing. And I don't think a shakeup is the worst thing that could happen. As far as writers are concerned, I do think it's important more than ever. I think this has always been important, but more than ever to hold fast to those things that made you first want to become a writer. Why do you love writing? I have talked about this in previous episodes, as anyone who has listened back through the past couple dozen episodes can tell you. Why did you want to be a writer? Once you start to replace that with dollar signs, and especially once you start to replace it with dollar signs and then rely on traditional publishing to give you your big break, I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but I will say that typically is very, very difficult to do. Doesn't mean it can't be done. Obviously, books are selling every day, but it is not an easy path for the vast majority of writers. I know these writers. I work with these writers. They have beautifully crafted query packets with their query letter, if they're querying agents, their short synopsis, their longer synopsis. They have the elevator pitch ready to go. They're going to conferences. They're doing speed dating sessions with agents, which I think slowly but surely are coming back and becoming a thing again. And the big danger that I see when things don't go as hoped is this cloud of discouragement can descend. And discouragement is something that I think we face as writers often. But when you take it to the level of trying to get traditionally published, that becomes a bigger thing. You've set your sights higher. In that case, I don't mean morally higher, ethically higher. I mean, you're trying to do something beyond just writing a book. You're trying to sell that book to someone or something, in the case of the publishing house entity, that will distribute that book, that will get that book out in front of readers. You're trying to do the big dream. And I would never discourage anyone from doing the big dream. Obviously, I think you have to do your due diligence, do the legwork, have your manuscript and your query and your other materials in phenomenal shape, because you are up against people who have been doing this for a long time. So that goes without saying. But what concerns me is that discouragement. It can feel so personal, and yet I know for a fact it is not personal. It's very, very impersonal, in fact. Again, publishing is a huge behemoth. I'm not saying it's evil. I think traditional publishing is very important. And it needs to be there. There needs to be that traditional publishing option. But as it stands now, with this sea change in publishing, it has become this just ginormous behemoth thing. And people haven't changed. Writers haven't changed. Writers still aspire to sort of join forces with it. This is sounding kind of dark. I don't mean for it to. But publishing has changed. It is no longer, the inroads to publishing are no longer what they once were. The gatekeeping, the barriers to entry have increased. Again, this is my very strong opinion based on research and experience, exponentially. And so, again, this is where I come down to saying I don't really know the answer, but I do caution writers that large disappointment may be forthcoming if you try to get traditionally published. Am I saying don't get traditionally published? No, I've already established that. I'm not. So how do we overcome that as writers? Someone might say, well, aim for traditionally published books, but just don't care that much. Don't let it get to you. Okay, couple things. That's easier said than done for some of us. Some of us tend to be, and again, I've talked about this in a previous episode, pretty sensitive to rejection. I think that's a human thing, but it can really be a thing for artists and writers and creative types. So easier said than done. I'm not saying it's impossible. And secondly, with that, I don't know that that's possible. If you're going to shoot for traditional publication in any serious way, you have to care. You have to take it seriously. You have to care at least enough to write a fantastic book. I don't think you can write a fantastic book. Someone prove me wrong here. If you kind of don't care. Yeah, I'm just doing this, but I don't really care how it turns out. My thought is that that's probably going to come through in the manuscript, and that won't be a book that knocks the socks off of agents and or editors. So I don't think that is an option. Another option people might say is, well, just don't let it get to you. Know that, let yourself kind of feel that discouragement, but then keep moving on, keep trying. And on one hand, yes, you have to have grit, you have to have determination, but I also think it's really important for writers to set boundaries around their writing time. Another truism about traditional publishing, and especially trying to break in as a debut, it is time consuming. You might not think it is, you might not think it will be. I'll just fire off some queries, it's all email, I'll jot down who I queried and we'll go from there. And again, it's unfortunately, in my experience and in the experience of many, many writers I know and have talked to, that's just not the case. It's time consuming. So I would love to hear your thoughts on what you think writers should do, how we are positioned as a group right now, and how you individually feel positioned in the face of the publishing behemoth, I think it's behemoth, that has been undergoing changes and is currently undergoing, and maybe these are just the changes culminating in this huge sea change. How you feel your position for that, how it's affected your outlook, how you view the writing, and do you feel that you've undergone, or that you need to undergo maybe, your own paradigm shift? Do you need to look at this whole publishing dream, the big dream, I'll call it, in a different way than you did maybe 10 years ago, even 5 years ago? Or have you not changed? Are you just holding firm and you are going for it and you're not going to let anything dissuade you? Or are you abandoning ship? Are you going indie, for example, or going on one of the free websites where you can just put your writing out there for free? I do think this sort of sea change can help us as writers who are not within the industry the way editors are, but we're still part of the industry. One might say we are the most important part of the industry, because without writers, publishing would cease to exist. I do think it can be helpful in that way, even if it is confusing, sometimes disturbing, and we don't always know where to turn or which way to go. I think it can be helpful to redefine where we stand in the face of these major changes. I know I have done that, and many writers I know have done that, and that's an ongoing process. When I say I have done that, it doesn't mean, well, I have a whole new paradigm and that's that, and I am unmoving and that will not change. It's not that. When I say I have done that, I mean I have started to consider my own position. I have shifted my paradigm, and I fully assume that that paradigm will continue to shift a little bit as more is revealed, as things continue to happen in the world of traditional publishing. Personally, I would love to see the smaller independent presses really have their day. I don't know how that happens, but I would love to see more vigor in the industry, less Borg, more variety, more options for writers, small houses, mid-size houses, and yes, the gigantor houses, absolutely. I was published by one of those gigantor houses. It was great. But if that's the be-all, end-all, then fewer and fewer authors, fewer and fewer writers are going to be able to be published. And even if they are published, they're going to, fewer and fewer of them will get the PR campaigns, the advertising campaigns that their books need to really do well. I'd love it if you would share your thoughts. This is, once again, the Groovy Writer, aka Nicole McInnes, coming to you from the wilds of the road. Leave a comment, hit subscribe. I'll see y'all later.